Yeah, and I was like, I'm the best Dragon Ball game ever made. You said that? You like that one, yeah. That was a good one, wasn't it? Yeah. Hey. Oh, Budokai 3! I'm so glad you actually made it. Come on in. Wait, was I the last one to come? Oh, I'm so sorry, man. Yeah, everyone made it. You don't have to apologize, though. We're just glad you made it here. Was someone else supposed to come? No, everyone I invited is already here. No one else should be... Hey, everyone. Hey, I didn't invite you. Leave, now! But I came from the same era, like, what? No! I don't want to hear any excuses. But you guys even invited Super Dragon Ball Z. That's not fair. No. What? Stop being so mean to me. No. What did I even do? When it comes to Dragon Ball games, I like to split them into eras. Wait, I didn't even try to make this intro sound like a Daradoya video. Dragon Ball has a plethora of games that exist, so there's absolutely no way I'll make a video on each game individually. I'll probably make a video here and there for some certain games, but don't expect all of them. But of course, with there being so many games, it's pretty easy to split them into eras. And this era that I'm about to talk about is probably the best one. Dragon Ball games have been coming out since the Famicom. I say Famicom instead of NES because those games didn't come out anywhere else except Japan. Well, technically, the first Dragon Ball game didn't even come out on the Famicom. It came out on a console called the Super Cassette Vision. That sounds like some sort of superpower. Okay, let me just put it in this way instead. Dragon Ball games have been coming out since 1986. There, now there's no confusion. I don't know how well these early games have been doing, but by the looks of it, it has been doing well enough to make more Dragon Ball games. It's pretty crazy to think of how old this series really is. Think about it like this, Dragon Ball games have been coming out before the series initially ended with Z, or GT since that actually came out right after Z. But by the time the final PlayStation 1 Dragon Ball game came out, the hype around GT was probably at its highest point. I wouldn't know because I didn't exist at that point. I guess in a way, that is true given the fact that Dragon Ball Final Bout came out almost exactly 3 months before GT ended. Given that there was no manga for GT, Omega Shenron didn't even exist. But little did everyone know, this was the last game to come out before the greatest era for Dragon Ball games. This was probably going to be the best time for Dragon Ball fans for a while. After Dragon Ball GT Final Bout, Dragon Ball games would be in a drought for a while, about 5 years to be specific. A console would come out, more powerful than the PlayStation 1, and it is the most sold console of all time. And that console is the PlayStation 2. 2 years after its release, a special game would come out and start the great era of Dragon Ball games. And that game is Dragon Ball Z Legendary Super Warriors for the Game Boy Color. Okay, I'm just kidding. That was the game that broke the long hiatus, but in 2002, another game would come out, and that game was Dragon Ball Z Budokai for the PlayStation 2. 3D in a Dragon Ball game wasn't so alien. I may have not owned Final Bout, but looking at gameplay, I can tell this just wasn't it. Maybe at the time it was crazy. Actually, I just looked at some footage from the game before, and that game looks better to play than Final Bout. Is GT ever gonna have any good qualities? Well, it had Super Saiyan 4, Gogeta Super Saiyan 4, some cool looking enemies, that nice Okay, I get it. Wait, didn't I kick you out last time? Dragon Ball Z Budokai was revolutionary in its own way. It's almost like a Tekken version of Dragon Ball. Budokai 1 may have been a bit rough, but it shows the foundation to a Dragon Ball era no one was ready for. Character models look gorgeous for the time, stages look great for the time, the UI is easy to understand for the time, and that gameplay was just amazing for the time. The physics feel just right. The game is pretty easy to pick up,
So there was a lot going for this game. Even the music is legendary to this day, although it's plagiarized. There were even what-if stories and a what-if character, Cellin. That's Cell if he absorbed Krillin. However, reviews for this game were along the lines of below a 7 out of 10. Well, that's okay, because the next game in the series was Dragon Ball Z Budokai 2. Coming out just a year after the first game, somehow, this game looks totally different. It still plays similar to Budokai 1, but it's more fleshed out. Now this game goes all the way to the Buu saga, unlike the last game, only going till the Cell saga. This game even adds some what-if characters, more like what-if transformations. And it isn't even a little bit. There is a grand total of 6 what-if transformations.
That's crazy, isn't it?
This game has some more good music which is plagiarized. This game did get better reviews from critics, but I'm pretty sure the fans were happy with this game. Now there's a special version of Dragon Ball Z Budokai 2 exclusive to Japan called Dragon Ball Z 2V. Dragon Ball Z Budokai in Japan is simply called Dragon Ball Z. So this was a version of Dragon Ball Z Budokai 2 that was given to 2000 V-Jump readers. Let me give you some context really quick. Jump is a magazine that typically has shonen manga in it. You would typically see your Dragon Ball, One Piece, etc. published there. V-Jump is a version of Jump that focuses on mainly video games and is published every month in Japan. Now, sometime in 2004 probably, it was announced that 2,000 lucky readers will be able to get this game. It doesn't really add anything new other than reskins you'll never see in any other Dragon Ball game or even media in that case. The reskins included are Goku with damaged gi, Piccolo wearing his turban and cape, Frieza being a Majin, Cooler as a reskin for Frieza, Frieza's son Kuriza as a reskin for Frieza, and Cell being a Majin.
I used to be so fascinated with Kuriza as a kid.
This game feels more like a developer version or a demo, as apparently there are no saves in this game and everything is unlocked from the start of the game. Budokai 3 was the next game in the series, adding even more things that just make the game better. It looks the best it ever looked. People would typically call this game or Budokai Tenkaichi 3 the best Dragon Ball game ever. The combat is the most fleshed out between the 3 games in the series. Even more characters were added and it goes all the way to GT somewhat. There were even some movie characters added like Cooler and Broly. You know this game is good when it adds Cyberman and Cell Jr. I could go on forever about why this game is good, but it would be much better if I were to make a whole video about it instead. Let's just say, this game is truly the best in the series. The Budokai series would prove that after every game, it would improve by a lot. And when you consider the fact that every game came out a year after each other, it feels like nothing can make Dragon Ball games boring. Now a secret game came out after Budokai 3, and I only wish that this game were fake, but the next game to come out was Dragon Ball Z Sagas. If you don't know what this game is, you're doing yourself a favor. This is probably the worst Dragon Ball game in existence. Maybe some people would consider it the worst game ever. In concept, this game sounds cool. The idea of a Dragon Ball action RPG game with the events of the Saiyan Saga till the Cell Saga. However, the gameplay is just bad. Like, what is this? Believe it or not, this was the only DBZ game on the original Xbox, which is just a loss to the original Xbox Dragon Ball fans. It also looks like this game only came out in the US. I can't find any info saying it came out anywhere else.
Poor America.
It makes sense given that this game was developed by a non-Japanese company, specifically in the US. But how did they ever get the okay to make this game? And how did Toei end up making original animation for this game of all games? It would have been safe to assume that the next Dragon Ball game to come out after Budokai 3 was another Budokai game in the series. However, that was not the case. Enter Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi. In Japan, this game is known as Dragon Ball Z Sparking. Now, I did make a whole video talking about this game by the way. so I'm gonna keep this short. I would personally say that this style of Dragon Ball games is the best for the franchise. However, that's mostly my bias talking. It often feels like, depending on which series you grew up with, that will be your favorite. But this game was pretty much showing the next steps for Dragon Ball games. Much bigger models taking up most of the screen, a completely different gameplay experience, and much different looking stages compared to the Budokai series. It is too crazy. I recently learned that the music in the Japanese version of this game is actually just reused music from the anime rather than what the international releases did by using the Budokai series' music. There was a game that came out between all this craziness. Super Dragon Ball Z slipped its way into the PlayStation 2 in 2006. This game was meant to be more of a fighting game than what Budokai Tenkaichi was aiming for. It looks just like an arcade game. That's because it is one. This game may not be a great game that many people are talking about, but in my opinion, the charm comes from the aesthetic of this game. This game may have been ahead of its time, trying to make everything look like it came straight out of a manga, or an anime depending on how you look at it. So it may not be worth remembering highly, but what it tried, it was definitely enough to give it a name. Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 2 is the next Dragon Ball game for the PS2 and the Budokai Tenkaichi series. This was the first Wii Dragon Ball game to come out too. They just skipped Budokai Tenkaichi 1 on the GameCube and Wii. To me, this game looks a bit different than the last, but I don't really know if that's true because I can't tell. This game adds more characters to the roster of the first game, mainly more movie and GT characters. I would say this game was definitely a great one for single player content. This game also had a Budokai 3-esque type of story mode. I would say this game's soundtrack is much nicer than Budokai Tenkaichi 3's, but that's me personally. However, people really don't talk much about this game. That's most likely because it doesn't do anything crazy to feel like a crazy new game. And that is because the next game would be considered the greatest Dragon Ball Z game ever to be made. Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 3 is the highest point for the Budokai Tenkaichi series. Some people even call it the highest point of Dragon Ball games. Let me just give you a quick list of what this game includes. The most characters in a Dragon Ball game. That includes transformations as a character slot. The most amount of stages in a Dragon Ball game, including all the different times of day. The most refined fighting experience in a Dragon Ball game. The fact that you can select different types of costumes for each character. A vast selection of modes. A bunch of story mode content. A great soundtrack. Graphics that don't look too bad in today's standards. And much more. This is another game I will eventually make a video on, as soon as I can get a copy of this game someday.
You see? This is the problem with not re-releasing a game in any way.
I would even consider this the greatest Dragon Ball game of all time. Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 3 was the last game for the Budokai Tenkaichi series. But it wasn't the last game that would make people remember this era of Dragon Ball games. Surprisingly, Dimps would create the last Budokai game in the series called Dragon Ball Z Infinite World. It was even called that in Japan, so no Dragon Ball Z 4. It may have a different name from the Budokai series, but in its essence, it's the same thing. This is probably the best of the Budokai series as well. The combat was the most refined here. There were some quality of life changes, but the most promising thing about this game is its character roster. It's bigger than Budokai 3, so you have many characters to enjoy. Many game critics actually gave this game a pretty low score, but I don't think they're looking at the bigger picture. If anything, this game is more like a Budokai 3.5 as it mainly changes things for the good. It even has an entirely new soundtrack. Maybe that's where this company was for the last 3 years of Dragon Ball games. But with this game came the end of the best era for Dragon Ball games. There was another game that came out in 2006 in Japan, but that game is way too different to be called a Dragon Ball game. It's called Battle Stadium DON for those of you wondering. The DON stands for Dragon Ball, One Piece, Naruto. Think of this game as a Smash version of Jump Force, but with only those 3 series representing Jump. The legacy these games had would just make people want another bunch of games like these ones. I doubt that newer Dragon Ball fans would think this is the best era of DBZ games. And that makes sense. However, for the people who lived in this era, this was their peak memory of Dragon Ball games. Bear in mind, these games came out at a time where Dragon Ball had no new content for a long time. It was clear that these games had a lot of love put into them. And when I say that, I mean that these games just felt so unique, so innovative, so perfect, that it's hard to see games like these ever coming back. Now I will go over 2 more eras Dragon Ball games would have, but be patient for those. The last statement I made would make sense once all 3 videos are out, including this one by the way.
Many concepts and ideas would be made during this era of Dragon Ball games that would solidify the direction of Dragon Ball games. I will say, you can decide what the best era was, as this was only my opinion. I know we'll never get an era like this again for Dragon Ball games, and being in the semi-drought that we're currently in, I'm somewhat skeptical of the future for Dragon Ball games. But this is what I consider as the best era of Dragon Ball games. Now, do any of you have a couple $100 you can spare? I kinda wanna buy Budokai Tenkaichi 3 off of eBay now.